So here's the thing, heroes, whether fictional or real, often live a pretty noble life. Superman worked as a reporter and sacrificed his true identity for anonymity. I'm looking at you, Clark. Batman, of course, was a billionaire, living a lavish life hidden from the obscurities of Gotham. Of course, we all know who he really was, but when we talk about heroes, a lot of us, especially as kids, picture knights. Shining armor, saving the princess, fighting off evil skeletons or dragons, you get the point. Realistically though, their lives actually sucked ass. Let me show you what I mean. Unlike the ephemeral image of a glittering knight triumphing in tournaments, real knights endured punishing training from childhood, served lords whose interests could drag them into endless local wars, and faced the unromantic tolls of battle, disease, injuries, and the raw brutality of close combat. Chivalry, while touted, was inconsistently practiced, often overshadowed by feudal politics and personal ambition. Maintaining expensive equipment, from war horses to armor, weighed heavily on a knight's finances and required unceasing attention. Further, in an era of limited medical knowledge, even minor wounds could threaten a warrior's life. Knights wrestled not just with the sword, but with social and religious pressures, vassal obligations to a lord, church calls for crusades, and fear of moral or spiritual failings. This script peels back the layers of romantic myth, peering into the daily burdens and mental strains that the typical medieval knight faced. From oppressive feudal obligations to coping with battlefield horrors, we'll unearth how their day-to-day existence often fell short of the fabled idyll so ingrained in popular culture. By the end, we'll see that knights truly carried the weight of an entire social order on their shoulders, an order that both revered and exploited them, leaving many knights to wonder whether the ring of steel on steel was worth the high cost in gold, blood, and peace of mind. Knighthood existed within the feudal system that structured much of medieval Europe, tying landholding to military service. Kings or higher nobles, often dukes or counts, granted fiefs, parcels of land, to vassals in exchange for a promise of armed assistance. Knights were typically sub-vassals, men holding smaller pieces of land from a baron or local lord. In return, these knights swore to fight when summoned, supply troops if needed, and remain loyal to their liege. At face value, receiving land might seem like a straightforward deal, one that provided both income and status, yet living up to feudal obligations was taxing. A knight could be called to muster at almost any time, whether to raid a rival domain, fight off invading forces, or help quell peasant rebellions. Lacking modern infrastructure, travel was slow and dangerous, especially with a heavy warhorse in gear. The call to arms might last weeks or months, time the knight would otherwise spend overseeing crops, collecting rents, or simply resting. Knightly service often demanded readiness on short notice, forcing them to juggle personal livelihoods with sudden mobilizations. Beyond the martial duties, knights also served roles in local administration or justice, sometimes acting as the lord's enforcers in feudal courts or assisting in tax collection. That placed them in awkward positions, potentially bridging the gap between an oppressive noble class and frustrated peasants. If their lord was unpopular, knights bore the brunt of local resentment, who saw them as instruments of feudal exploitation. Such responsibilities, layered atop the risk of battlefield injuries, weighed heavily on their daily existence. These manifold obligations also limited knights' independence. They might long for personal glory or forging alliances that could further their family's ambitions, but feudal bonds constrained them to serve the overlord's agenda first. If the lord demanded they wage a feudal war or side with morally dubious actions, a knight had little recourse except obedience. In this sense, their respected position in the hierarchy carried a burden of compliance, overshadowing the illusions of gallant freedom romanticized in modern stories. A medieval knight's journey began in boyhood, long before he earned the title or lifted a real lance. Around age 7, a noble child might be sent to a relative's or lord's castle as a page, assigned menial tasks like serving at tables, cleaning equipment, or running errands. These chores, while humble, introduced the boy to courtly life. Meanwhile, older knights or squires taught him basic courtesy, stable management, and the first seeds of martial skill. As he advanced into adolescence, the boy became a squire, devoting himself to a particular knight or lord. This was no gentle apprenticeship. Squires practiced swordsmanship, wrestling, archery, and horseback riding daily, often from dawn until exhaustion. They polished their knight's armor, groomed horses, and accompanied campaigns as auxiliary helpers. If a campaign turned bloody, a squire might be thrust into real combat before formal knighting. Mistakes could prove fatal. A squire's job might be to carry valuable gear through mud and chaos, risking ambush. Tournaments added further pressure. Squires were expected to hone jousting or melee skills under a watchful crowd, possibly facing higher status or more experienced opponents. Injuries were commonplace: broken bones, concussions, or even fatal mishaps. Meanwhile, the training environment was strictly hierarchical. A squire who offended a knight might face humiliating punishments. Overbearing discipline and harsh living conditions shaped them into hardened warriors, but also left mental scars. This demanding apprenticeship could last a decade or more, overshadowed by uncertainty. If the squire failed to impress or lost a sponsor, he might never be dubbed a knight. The emotional stress of meeting a teacher's expectations or family ambitions weighed heavily. The culminating ceremony, dubbing, was a proud moment. But behind that ceremonial vow to uphold chivalry lay years of punishing labor, humiliations, and bodily risk. So while the dream of knighthood glimmered, the route to that dream was laborious, and many youths realized early that the glamorous illusions seldom matched the physical toil and dangers of forging a martial identity. Though popular imagination pictures knights in shining plate armor, early medieval knights wore chainmail hauberks, a coif, and perhaps splinted arm or leg protection. By the 14th and 15th centuries, full plate armor became more common among wealthier knights. Regardless of era, the kit was often extremely heavy. Chainmail alone could weigh 20 to 30 pounds, while 15th century plate suits might surpass 50 to 60 pounds, plus the helmet, shield, and weapons. Wearing it demanded considerable strength and stamina. Combat maneuvers, from mounting a horse to wielding a sword effectively, became profoundly exhausting over extended engagements. Furthermore, a knight typically needed multiple sets of gear: heavy mail or plate for pitched battles, lighter gear for traveling or patrolling, plus specialized pieces for jousts or ceremonial events. The cost of forging and maintaining this equipment was immense. Skilled armorers had to custom-shape pieces for each knight's build, and the slightest ill fit might hamper movement or cause painful chafing. Regular upkeep involved scouring rust, repairing dents, and ensuring straps, buckles, and rivets all functioned. Travel in damp climates meant frequent re-oiling or polishing to prevent corrosion. Weapons also encompassed more than just a sword. Knights carried lances for the mounted charge, a dagger or misericord to finish wounded enemies, possibly a mace or warhammer for crushing plate. Each had its own set of forging or upkeep demands. Replacing a broken lance tip or reinforcing a sword's pommel came with a price. In a protracted war, or if a knight was called to multiple campaigns, this cycle of equipment refurbishment devoured funds. All this hardware also made daily life cumbersome. Even a brief training session in full armor could cause overheating or dehydration. In the chaos of real battles, a fallen knight, pinned beneath his gear, might face a quick death if no ally could free him. The pride of sporting a gleaming suit did not erase the burden, and in the brutal swirl of medieval warfare, that proud sheen might quickly vanish under mud, blood, and the sweat of a soldier who asked himself if the cost truly matched the fleeting sense of heroic identity. Knighthood wasn't merely a status, it was also a financial obligation. Owning war horses, paying squires, forging or repairing armor, and traveling to wars or tournaments demanded vast resources. Even land grants from lords might not suffice if local peasants offered limited revenue or if harvest failed. Knights frequently took on debt to cover shortfalls, hoping plunder or ransoms gleaned from war could offset expenses. At times, a knight would pledge family lands or rents to finance a single campaign. If the war proved unprofitable, whether due to lost battles or meager spoils, he might return heavily indebted, struggling to pay soldiers he'd hired or repay moneylenders. Tournaments could help glean prizes, but they were also expensive to enter, requiring fresh sets of showy armor and retinues. A few successful knights turned tournaments into a livelihood, but many risked financial ruin upon defeat, or if they sustained crippling injuries. Besides equipment upkeep, maintaining a suitable retinue at one's castle or manor placed continuing strain on finances. Feasts, lodging for visiting nobles, and obligations like wedding gifts or funeral ceremonies for local allies all added up. The feudal code demanded hospitality, so knights, though lords of small domains, seldom lived in opulent conditions. They worried about raising enough revenue to keep men at arms or stable hands for their war horses. When the lord summoned them for war, it might not always be a chance for profit. Some wars ended quickly or were purely defensive, offering little in the way of loot. Others turned into grueling stalemates, draining the treasury. The forced absence from home meant the knight had less time to oversee farmland or collect rents personally, risking mismanagement or corruption by lesser stewards. The cycle thus fed anxiety. Beneath the veneer of gallantry, knights juggled ledgers and hammered out deals, cognizant that failure to fund one's obligations might forfeit the entire knightly estate, diminishing them to lesser status. This economic stress overshadowed the illusions of romantic adventure, reminding knights that the cost of martial glory often tested even the wealthiest among them. While knighthood conjures images of skillful jousts or shining horse charges, the real battlefield was far from clean. Conflicts typically involved chaotic skirmishes, sieges of muddy fortifications, or pitched battles where lines of infantry clashed. Archers rained arrows, and knights attempted cavalry charges that might break or fail amid upturned ground. In the midst of such violence, even heavily armored knights were not invincible. Stray crossbow bolts pierced mail, axes shattered helmets, or a simple slip in the mud led to a fatal trampling. The first wave of a cavalry charge often faced sharpened stakes or hidden pitfalls laid by the opposing force. Injuries spanned from flesh wounds to catastrophic fractures, dislocated shoulders from a lance blow, or deep punctures from halberds. Field medicine in the so-called Dark Ages was rudimentary. Surgeons might amputate or attempt to cauterize gashes using heated irons. Without antiseptics, infection flourished, dooming many who survived the initial injury. Furthermore, even away from pitched battles, knights faced disease from poor camp sanitation. Dysentery, typhus, or plague-like outbreaks scythed through armies, sometimes killing more than direct combat. Camp life in medieval Europe rarely had systematic hygiene, so knights, for all their prestige, had no immunity to the pandemics that riddled their rank-and-file men. Marching under the sun in layers of metal and leather, knights risked heat exhaustion and dehydration. Cumulative psychological stress also weighed on them. War was personal, involving face-to-face confrontation. Striking an opponent at close range demanded both bravery and the capacity to ignore moral hesitations. A knight might witness friends dismembered or horses screaming in pain. The code of chivalry allegedly governed these interactions, but in the heat of real battle, cruelty and acts of savagery occurred frequently. The emotional toll of repeated campaigns could leave a knight disillusioned or burdened by guilt, an unseen mental cost overshadowing the ephemeral pageantry. Medieval treaties and romances lauded chivalry as an ethic championing bravery, courtesy, faithfulness to one's lord, and protection of the weak. Many knights aspired to live up to these virtues. They undertook vigil nights before dubbing ceremonies, swore solemn oaths, and revered mythical figures like King Arthur. Yet day-to-day life on campaign or in feudal courts placed these ideals under severe strain. For instance, defending the weak often collided with the harsh economic reality of collecting rents, forcibly punishing peasants who lagged in taxes, or pillaging enemy villages to feed armies. Courtesy to ladies might be overshadowed by forced marriages or abductions that served political alliances. Honorable combat rarely matched the swirl of ambushes, night raids, or illusions of honor among knights. If an enemy knight was wealthy, capturing him for ransom was a priority, but common foot soldiers might be slaughtered or enslaved. The code gave wide latitude for cruelty, provided one's lord accepted it. Knights strove to uphold piety, fighting under the cross in a crusade or seeking the church's blessing, yet local feuds pitted Christian lord against Christian lord, trivializing that shared faith. Many knights struggled to reconcile a vow of Christian virtue with the brutal nature of feudal warfare. Some joined holy wars, expecting indulgences or divine favor, only to witness or commit atrocities along the way. This gap between literary chivalry and actual practice can partly explain why many knights felt frustration or cynicism. They recognized the enormous hypocrisy in a system that praised generosity but demanded extortionate taxes, or claimed moral uprightness but championed raids on civilians. Over time, some knights found solace in personal devotions or strong ties with monastic movements. Others sank into the practicality that chivalry was more a social code for aristocrats than a genuine moral system. Whatever their stance, living up to chivalric ideals was rarely a straightforward path, and failing them carried shame and guilt in a society that still revered the code, at least nominally. Amid the Dark Ages, a term used loosely to describe early medieval centuries, though the 11th to 13th centuries witnessed significant developments, the concept of knighthood intersected with grand religious calls, the Crusades. Popes declared holy wars to reclaim or defend the Holy Land from Muslim powers. Knights, hearing these appeals, found themselves morally and socially compelled to participate. Noble families saw crusading as a route to demonstrate piety, possibly gain lands or treasure, and earn the church's remission of sins. Yet the journey to Outremer was arduous. Knights undertook long, perilous treks across Europe, Asia Minor, or traveled by sea in cramped vessels. Disease thrived in cramped crusader camps. Desert warfare in Levantine climates stressed men and horses unaccustomed to scorching temperatures. Cultural misunderstandings between crusaders and local Christian or Muslim inhabitants led to fiascos. While some knights found spiritual inspiration in seeing biblical sites, others encountered profound shock at the cruelty inflicted upon towns during conquests or the hardships of siege warfare in the region. Returning crusaders might find themselves in debt as they had financed expensive equipment, shipping costs, or retinues for the expedition. Although stories circulated of those who gained fortunes in loot, many discovered the reality far less rewarding. The glory of taking part in a holy campaign sometimes dimmed when faced with the brutality inflicted on both enemy and civilian populations, raising moral qualms. Even within the crusading movement, knights encountered rivalry among their own ranks, fractious leadership, and alliances shaped more by personal interest than unified faith. Hence, while crusading added a spiritual dimension to the knight's identity, reinforcing a sense of devout mission, it also increased the burdens they bore. The dual role of local enforcer and distant holy warrior amplified the demands placed on them, leaving many knights psychologically taxed and physically impoverished by repeated calls to fight for God. The illusions of redemption clashed with the raw greed and bloodshed that reality often entailed. Knights not only marched to external wars, but also navigated a labyrinth of feudal court politics. Lords and ladies shaped alliances through marriages, inheritances, or cunning deals behind the scenes. A knight with moderate landholdings risked exploitation by cunning barons, or found himself enmeshed in personal feuds. Rival knights might vie for the same manor or bishop's favor, leading to lethal duels or protracted vendettas. If a lord's court grew suspicious that a knight was disloyal or harboring ambitions, accusations of treachery might surface, forcing a trial by combat or a humiliating public oath, swearing to clear one's name. The system left little recourse for those lacking powerful allies. Meanwhile, wealthier aristocrats sometimes poached talented knights from lesser lords through offers of better fiefs or marriage alliances. Knights seeking personal advancement had to navigate these opportunities while avoiding charges of disloyalty. The question of inheritance posed further tension. A knight might own farmland or a castle, but if he died, how would the property pass on to heirs? Feudal law typically demanded a liege's approval or demanded fees for the next generation to inherit. This created financial or legal stress. Splintering of property among multiple heirs could degrade a knightly family's resources, leading to sibling feuds or the diminishing of each share to near irrelevance. All these intricacies caused knights to constantly weigh their options, remain faithful to a single overlord, or negotiate a shift to a stronger patron. They faced personal risk if the lord lost political battles, since captive knights might be ransomed, exiled, or forcibly turned into the victor's agent. Simply put, behind the veneer of stable feudal ranks lay cutthroat maneuvering. A single misstep in aristocratic politics could see a knight stripped of land, imprisoned, or forced to attempt a dangerous comeback, placing further strain on an already precarious existence. Beyond the scars of war, knights endured daily hardships that modern culture often glosses over. The dietary regime might be heavy on bread, meat, or ale, but lacking in fresh vegetables, leading to nutritional gaps. Long riding hours contributed to chronic back pain or joint problems. Festering wounds from minor scrapes or chainmail friction posed infection risks with no antibiotics available. Some knights found themselves dealing with degenerative injuries in their 30s or 40s, well before old age. Daily hygiene was rudimentary. Bathing was not always frequent, and communal living in castles or campaign tents created breeding grounds for lice, fleas, and contagious ailments. For religious or superstitious reasons, some knights tried to practice cleanliness, but logistics and cultural norms meant limited bathing facilities. On campaign, filth was constant. Soiled clothing, muddy boots, and unclean water sources. The stench of stables, unwashed men, and rotting battlefield corpses lingered. Mentally, the knight faced a swirl of anxieties: the dread of each battle, the need to maintain or repay debts, the pressure to live up to chivalric ideals, and possible guilt over moral failings. The era lacked the concept of trauma counseling. Many knights, returning from brutal war experiences, had no outlet for processing nightmares or the grief of losing close companions. They might find solace in religion, penances, or gifts to the church, but the psychological burden remained. Adding to this was the knowledge that a single defeat could unravel a knight's entire fortune. Horse lost, armor captured, ransoms demanded. Freed after captivity, a knight might struggle to reassemble the puzzle of his battered life. In some, though the label of knight conjured prestige, the day-to-day reality in the so-called Dark Ages was a precarious existence, requiring unyielding resilience against physical wear, emotional strain, and the constant specter of financial or political ruin. The shining image of a medieval knight, resplendent in polished armor, championing justice, and enjoying feasts in a lord's hall, represented only a thin veneer, masking a far more grueling reality. From a tender age, prospective knights endured rigorous, often demeaning training. Upon attaining knighthood, they entered a vortex of feudal duties, forced to respond whenever their overlords summoned them for war or local enforcement. They shouldered expensive equipment costs, maintained war horses, and financed retinues, all while struggling to manage farmland or fiefs that might or might not yield stable income. On the battlefield, the famed armor proved both a shield and an encumbrance, draining stamina, compounding injuries, and heightening the perils of being unhorsed. Chivalry, though hailed as a moral code, collided routinely with the harshness of feudal violence, the bloodiness of crusading ventures, and the grim necessity of raiding or pillaging. Political intrigue within courts could swiftly ruin a knight's carefully nurtured career if he failed to navigate alliances or upset a powerful rival. Throughout it all, basic hygiene, medical ignorance, and the specter of widespread disease reminded knights that no social rank was safe from the medieval environment's brutal truths. For many knights, fleeting moments of honor or martial glory were overshadowed by the daily burdens and physical tolls that made each campaign a gamble. The illusions that saturate modern popular culture, focusing on gallantry, tournaments, and romantic ideals, omit the injuries, humiliations, and heartbreak that knights quietly bore. Squires languished in exhausting service. War itself was rarely a thing of heroic color, but a messy onslaught of guttural violence. And the payoff of spoils or prestige seldom matched the cost of participation. Yet for all these hardships, knights remained integral to medieval society. Their training and discipline formed a protective shield against external threats, from raiders to rival lords. The spectacle of a knight's shining helmet or a cavalry charge resonated with medieval imaginations, fueling narratives of valor that would shape centuries of chivalric literature and eventually morph into the romantic stereotypes we know today. Once those illusions are stripped back, however, it's clear that the day-to-day life of a medieval knight was fraught with risk, penury, exhaustion, and moral contradiction, revealing just how much it truly sucked to be a knight in the so-called Dark Ages.